Good evening, crew, and welcome back to yet another daily episode of Background Historian. Make sure to subscribe so you stay notified for daily videos to help you fall asleep. Tonight we won't be exploring a country, tradition, or person. Instead, we will shift our focus to the existential debate of if there is a God that governs this planet and universe. We will break down different philosophers' perspectives over the years, and give you the information you need to examine for yourself if there is a true omniscient being that has given life to each and every one of us. As always, dim the lights, lay back, and listen as you drift off to sleep. Part 1: Early Human Religion and Skepticism in Prehistoric and Ancient Societies. Introduction. The debate between belief and unbelief, between those who affirm the existence of gods and those who doubt or deny them, did not begin with modern philosophers like Hume, Nietzsche, or Dawkins. It has roots that reach far deeper, into the earliest stirrings of human thought, back when our ancestors first looked to the skies, the forests, the storms, and the stars with wonder, fear, and reverence. To understand the long contest between atheism and faith, we must begin at the very beginning, with the dawn of religious imagination in prehistoric societies, and with the faint but fascinating traces of early skepticism that appeared alongside it. This first part traces humanity's earliest religious expressions, the birth of gods and myths, and the earliest recorded whispers of doubt. It is less a debate in the formal sense and more a set of competing orientations, some toward reverence, ritual, and divine explanation, others toward pragmatism, materialism, and doubt. Both tendencies, belief and skepticism, emerged side by side, shaping the foundations for thousands of years of debate to come. The origins of religious thought. Archaeological evidence suggests that religious thought is nearly as old as humanity itself. Long before cities, alphabets, and philosophy, prehistoric humans expressed ideas of the sacred. Burial practices dating back over 100,000 years reveal intentional positioning of bodies, burial goods, and pigments like red ochre, suggesting a belief in an afterlife or spiritual significance. For early humans, religion was not an abstract debate but a deeply practical framework. The natural world was dangerous and mysterious. Storms, plagues, droughts, and death required explanation. Religion offered narratives that gave meaning, order, and perhaps a sense of control. Shamans and priests emerged, mediating between ordinary people and the unseen world. Yet alongside these tendencies toward reverence, there were surely skeptics. Some individuals may have doubted the shaman's power, questioned the efficacy of rituals, or dismissed unseen forces when they did not produce results. These early skeptics left no direct written record, but anthropologists studying modern hunter-gatherer groups observe that doubt is always present, even if often suppressed by communal pressure. The first civilizations, Mesopotamia and Egypt. Mesopotamia. In the Fertile Crescent, humanity's first great civilizations arose, bringing writing, law, and organized religion. The Sumerians, Akkadians, Babylonians, and Assyrians worshipped a vast pantheon of gods tied to natural forces, Anu, Enlil, Ishtar, Marduk. Myths like the Epic of Gilgamesh reflected humanity's struggles with mortality, divine power, and meaning. Religion permeated Mesopotamian life, but traces of doubt appear in their literature. The Dialogue of Pessimism, a Babylonian text from around the 1st millennium BCE, depicts a master and servant weighing choices, only to dismiss each one as meaningless. Though not explicitly atheistic, it conveys skepticism about the value of ritual and life itself. Similarly, parts of Gilgamesh reflect a recognition of human finitude without the consolation of eternal life, an acknowledgement that gods may not solve the problem of death. Egypt. Ancient Egypt revolved around gods like Ra, Osiris, and Isis, and pharaohs were considered divine. Religion reinforced political power, promising cosmic order, Ma'at, and immortality. Monumental architecture, the pyramids, temples, tombs, manifested faith in a divine order stretching beyond death. Yet Egyptian texts also contain laments and doubts. The dispute between Amen and his Ba, soul, is one of the earliest dialogues resembling existential questioning. In it, a man despairs of life's suffering and debates suicide, expressing doubt about whether the afterlife is real or desirable. This suggests that even in one of history's most religious societies, seeds of skepticism were present. Ancient India and early skepticism. The Indian subcontinent produced one of the world's richest religious landscapes, with Vedic religion eventually evolving into Hinduism, Buddhism, and Jainism. The Rig Veda, composed around 1500 BCE, contains hymns praising gods like Indra, Agni, and Varuna. Yet even here we find strikingly skeptical tones. The Nasadiya Sukta, Hymn of Creation, speculates on the origins of the universe with radical uncertainty. Whence this creation has arisen, perhaps it formed itself, or perhaps it did not, the one who looks down on it, in the highest heaven, only he knows, or perhaps he does not know. This early admission of doubt reveals that atheism, or at least agnosticism, was not an alien intrusion but an integral strand of early thought. Later, Indian philosophical schools like the Carvaka, Lokayata, explicitly denied the existence of gods, rejecting ritual and the afterlife, and embracing materialism. Though marginalized, they represent one of the earliest systematic forms of atheism. Greece. The birth of rational debate. Nowhere did the tension between belief and doubt flourish more clearly than in ancient Greece. Greek religion, with its Olympian gods, provided a vibrant mythological framework. But alongside myth, the Greeks birthed philosophy, and with it, rational challenges to religion. Early Greek thinkers. Xenophanes, 6th century BCE, criticized anthropomorphic gods, noting that if animals could paint, they would depict gods in their own image. He suggested there may be one god beyond human comprehension. Heraclitus spoke of a universal logos, rational order, shifting focus from myth to reason. Democritus and Leucippus developed atomism, explaining the world without recourse to divine intervention. Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. Socrates, though accused of impiety, Socrates spoke of a divine voice guiding him. His trial, however, reveals how questioning gods could be seen as dangerous. Plato defended the idea of transcendent realities and a divine good, but also criticized the immoral behavior attributed to the gods in myths. Aristotle conceived of an unmoved mover, a rational principle underlying the cosmos, not the capricious gods of Homer, but a philosophical deity. Epicureans and skeptics. Perhaps the clearest ancient atheists were the Epicureans. Epicurus, 341 to 270 BCE, argued that the gods, if they existed, were indifferent to human affairs. Fear of divine punishment and death, he claimed, was the chief source of human misery. Lucretius, a Roman Epicurean, wrote on the nature of things, explaining the world in terms of atoms and void, dismissing superstition. Meanwhile, Pyrrhonian skeptics suspended judgment on metaphysical claims, doubting that knowledge of gods was possible. Ancient China, harmony without theism. In China, the religious philosophical traditions of Confucianism, Taoism, and later Buddhism shaped thought. Unlike Western traditions, these were often less concerned with gods and more with ethics, order, and harmony. Confucius, 551 to 479 BCE, spoke little of gods, focusing instead on moral duty and social harmony. Taoism, Laozi, Zhuangzi emphasized the Tao, Wei, an ineffable principle of harmony, not a personal deity but a cosmic order. Mozi, 5th century BCE, criticized elaborate rituals, emphasizing pragmatic benefit. Though not atheistic in the modern sense, these traditions reveal how belief systems could function without a central God concept. Rome, religion, skepticism, and politics. The Roman world absorbed Greek philosophy and applied it in new contexts. Roman religion was pragmatic, emphasizing ritual and state order rather than deep theology. Cicero, for example, debated the existence of gods, weighing Stoic arguments for divine providence against Epicurean skepticism. Roman authorities tolerated many religions but cracked down on groups that threatened political order. Christianity, at first, was seen as atheistic because it rejected the Roman pantheon. Ironically, early Christians were accused of atheism for denying the gods, even as they proclaimed the one true God. The tension between faith and doubt. From these early civilizations, we see a recurring pattern. Religion emerges to explain and control the world, offering meaning and order. Skepticism arises in response, questioning myths, rituals, and divine justice. Both coexist, shaping one another. Religion grows more sophisticated when challenged, and doubt sharpens its arguments when faced with strong faith. Even in deeply religious cultures, voices of uncertainty appear, in laments, philosophical inquiries, or outright denials. This tension would only grow more explicit as history moved into the classical and medieval eras. Conclusion. The earliest phases of the debate between atheism and belief in God were less about systematic arguments and more about orientations of mind. Awe versus doubt, reverence versus critique, myth versus philosophy. The seeds of both sides were planted in the fertile soil of ancient human experience. From the burial rites of Neanderthals to the skeptical hymns of the Rig Veda, from Xenophanes' critique of gods to Lucretius' materialism, humanity has always wrestled with whether gods exist, whether they care, and whether they are necessary to explain the world. In the next part of this series, we will move deeper into classical Greek and Roman philosophy, where the debate becomes sharper, with sophisticated arguments for divine design on one side and equally sophisticated arguments for naturalism on the other. Part 2. Ancient Greek Philosophy and the Birth of Skepticism. The Greek Context. While Mesopotamian, Egyptian, and early Near Eastern traditions were deeply theistic, the Greeks developed something unique, a philosophical framework that could question the gods themselves. By the 5th and 4th centuries BCE, Athens had become a hotbed of intellectual experimentation. Mythology was still strong, Homer and Hesiod provided the cultural backdrop, but thinkers began treating the gods not as unquestionable realities but as topics for rational investigation. The Sophists and early challenges. The Sophists were among the first to introduce radical skepticism. Protagoras famously declared, "Man is the measure of all things," a statement that shifts authority from the divine to human perception. Even more controversial was his statement, concerning the gods, "I have no means of knowing whether they exist or not, nor of what sort they may be." This was perhaps the earliest explicit statement of agnosticism in Western thought. Critias, another sophist, went further. He argued that belief in gods was deliberately invented by rulers to instill fear and enforce social order. According to him, the gods were not real beings but psychological tools. This strikingly anticipates later critiques by modern atheists, suggesting religion serves more as social control than divine truth. Socrates and the religious tension. Socrates did not deny the gods outright, but his relentless questioning posed a serious threat to traditional beliefs. He spoke of a personal daimonion or inner voice, which some Athenians saw as undermining official religious devotion. His trial and execution in 399 BCE for corrupting the youth and impiety illustrate the danger of challenging orthodoxy in a society still tied to its pantheon. Socrates' death became a symbol of the tension between reason and religion, a recurring theme in the atheism-theism debate. Plato and the divine ideal. Plato attempted a reconciliation. In his dialogues, he criticized popular myths for their immorality but did not abandon belief in higher powers. Instead, he redefined divinity in philosophical terms. The gods became less like Zeus throwing thunderbolts and more like abstract, eternal principles, the forms, with the form of the good at the summit. For Plato, the divine was the foundation of morality and truth, but it was stripped of anthropomorphism. This shift would echo through centuries, influencing Jewish, Christian, and Islamic theology as they sought to harmonize reason and revelation. Aristotle's unmoved mover. Aristotle took another step. He rejected the traditional pantheon altogether in favor of a singular, purely rational concept, the unmoved mover. For him, this was not a personal god who interfered in human affairs, but the necessary, eternal principle that set the cosmos in motion. This god did not answer prayers or write laws but embodied pure actuality. While not atheism, Aristotle's philosophy stripped divinity of its mythic and personal qualities, leaving a cold, intellectual deity. Later theologians, both medieval Christians and Muslims, would seize on this idea to support monotheistic belief. The atomists, toward materialism. Perhaps the most radical were the atomists, Democritus, Leucippus, and later Epicurus. They argued that the universe consisted solely of atoms moving in the void. Everything, including the soul, could be explained by natural processes. Epicurus in particular saw belief in vengeful gods as harmful to human happiness. While he allowed that gods might exist, he insisted they had no role in human affairs. His teaching was essentially practical atheism: live without fear of divine punishment, seek tranquility, and pursue simple pleasures. Epicureanism thus became one of the earliest explicit philosophical challenges to religion as a moral necessity. Stoicism and the return of divine order. In contrast, the Stoics reasserted divinity but in a naturalistic form. They envisioned the universe itself as infused with logos, a rational principle or divine fire. For them, living in harmony with this divine order was the path to virtue. While not atheistic, Stoicism downplayed traditional gods, presenting instead a pantheistic worldview that blurred the line between theism and rational naturalism. This appealed to Romans, who would later merge Stoic ideas with empire and law. Legacy for the debate. Ancient Greece set the stage for nearly every major argument still found today in the atheism-theism debate. Skeptical critiques of religion as human invention, Critias. Agnostic uncertainty, Protagoras. Redefinitions of the divine in philosophical terms, Plato, Aristotle, Stoics. Naturalistic explanations of the cosmos, Atomists, Epicureans. Moral arguments for and against belief, fear of divine punishment versus tranquility without gods. These frameworks would be inherited by Rome, filtered into early Jewish and Christian thought, and resurface centuries later in Enlightenment debates. The Greeks provided not only gods but the intellectual tools to question them, making them a pivotal chapter in the long story of belief and disbelief. Part 3: The Roman World, Judaism, and the Early Christian Response. The Roman religious landscape. When Rome expanded across the Mediterranean, it inherited the philosophical legacies of Greece and the religious practices of countless conquered peoples. Roman religion was primarily polytheistic and pragmatic, focused on rituals, sacrifices, and public ceremonies rather than theological doctrine. The gods were patrons of civic life, and their favor was tied to the success of the empire. Yet Roman culture also absorbed Greek philosophy, which meant that alongside temples to Jupiter and Mars, there were educated elites reading Epicurus and debating Aristotle. This created a tension. Ordinary Romans practiced rituals, while intellectuals increasingly questioned the gods' literal existence. Cicero and the religious debate. Cicero, 106–43 BCE, one of Rome's greatest thinkers, captured this debate vividly. In works like On the Nature of the Gods, he laid out competing arguments from Stoics, Epicureans, and skeptics. The Stoics argued for a rational, providential order guiding the universe. The Epicureans dismissed divine intervention, claiming the gods existed but were indifferent to human affairs. The skeptics suggested that certainty was impossible and belief should remain suspended. Cicero himself leaned toward a kind of theological agnosticism. He valued religion as a social and moral glue, even if its metaphysical claims were uncertain. This utilitarian defense of religion, supporting belief because of its social benefits, would echo centuries later in Enlightenment debates. Judaism and monotheism in the Roman Empire. Into this environment stepped Judaism, with its uncompromising monotheism. Jewish communities throughout the empire resisted Roman polytheism, often suffering persecution for refusing to worship Roman gods or the emperor. The Jewish insistence on one God who was invisible, omnipotent, and morally demanding clashed with Roman tolerance of many gods. To Roman authorities, Jewish exclusivity appeared subversive. Yet Judaism also fascinated some intellectuals, who admired its moral seriousness and its rejection of idolatry. This moment was crucial in the atheism-theism debate. For the first time, polytheists encountered a widespread movement that outright denied the existence of all gods but one. To the Romans, Jews looked suspiciously like atheists because they rejected the state's divinities. In reality, they were radical theists. But the confusion shows how fragile the definitions of belief and unbelief were in antiquity. Christianity, a new theological force. Out of Judaism emerged Christianity, which spread rapidly across the empire in the 1st century CE. Christianity radicalized the Jewish monotheistic message, universalizing it and centering it on the figure of Christ. For Christians, Roman gods were not merely irrelevant, they were false. This exclusivity brought Christians into conflict with Roman authorities, who valued religious pluralism as a way to unify the empire. To Romans, refusing to sacrifice to Jupiter was not private disbelief but political rebellion. Thus, Christians were accused of atheism because they denied the gods of Rome. Early apologists like Justin Martyr and Tertullian embraced this accusation, insisting that their faith was the true worship of the real God, while Roman religion was empty superstition. Philosophical Christianity and the defense of belief. Christian thinkers also absorbed Greek philosophical tools to defend their beliefs. Origen, Augustine, and others engaged directly with skepticism and materialism. Augustine's City of God, early 5th century CE, was especially significant. It argued that Rome fell not because of Christianity but because pagan gods had never truly protected it. He reframed the debate by asserting that human history itself had a divine plan. By this stage, the intellectual ground had shifted. Christianity was no longer a fringe sect but an imperial religion, especially after Constantine's conversion in the 4th century. The debate between atheists and theists now unfolded within a largely Christianized empire. The main opponents of belief were not public officials defending Jupiter but philosophers defending materialism, skepticism, or Epicurean naturalism. Seeds of the ongoing debate. The Roman period highlighted enduring themes that would resurface later. Religion as social order, Cicero, Roman utilitarianism. Atheism as political rebellion, Romans accusing Jews and Christians. Philosophical defenses of theism, Stoic rationality, Christian theology. Naturalistic alternatives, Epicurean materialism. The blending of Greek philosophy, Roman pragmatism, Jewish monotheism, and Christian theology set the stage for the medieval synthesis. And for later clashes between science and faith. The language of belief, unbelief, heresy, and atheism that developed in this period would shape how the West defined the debate for centuries to come. Part 4, the medieval synthesis, Christianity, Islam, and Jewish philosophy. The intellectual climate of the Middle Ages. By the early medieval period, roughly 500 to 1500 CE, much of Europe had become Christianized. Meanwhile, the Islamic world was experiencing a flourishing of science, philosophy, and theology, and Jewish communities across Europe and the Middle East were deeply engaged in both scriptural and philosophical debates. This era is often remembered as one where religion reigned supreme and atheism was virtually non-existent. While it is true that outright denial of God was rare and dangerous, the Middle Ages laid crucial groundwork for the later atheist-theist debate. Thinkers from Christianity, Islam, and Judaism not only defended their faith but also built sophisticated philosophical systems that engaged deeply with questions of reason, doubt, and divine existence. Christianity and scholastic thought. In the Christian West, scholars developed scholasticism, an intellectual tradition that sought to harmonize faith and reason. The leading figure here was Thomas Aquinas, 1225 to 1274, whose Summa Theologica presented one of the most systematic defenses of Christian belief ever written. Aquinas used Aristotelian philosophy, newly rediscovered through Islamic and Jewish scholarship, to argue for God's existence. His famous 5 ways offered logical demonstrations of God as the unmoved mover, the necessary being, and the ultimate cause of order. While Aquinas' arguments were intended to strengthen belief, they also opened up space for rational critique. If God's existence could be proven through logic, then it could also be disputed through logic. Thus, the very scholastic method created opportunities for later skepticism. Islam and the flourishing of philosophy. In the Islamic world, philosophy, falsafa, and theology, kalam, thrived between the 8th and 12th centuries. Thinkers like Al-Farabi, Avicenna, Ibn Sina, and Averroes, Ibn Rushd, developed sophisticated arguments about God's nature, often drawing on Aristotle and Plato. Avicenna proposed a distinction between necessary and contingent existence, claiming that God was the necessary being who sustains all else. Averroes defended the compatibility of reason and revelation, arguing that philosophy and scripture ultimately pointed to the same truths. At the same time, some theologians, such as Al-Ghazali, pushed back. In The Incoherence of the Philosophers, he argued that rational philosophy had limits and that only revelation could provide certainty about God. This internal debate within Islam mirrored broader questions: could reason alone prove God's existence? Or was faith ultimately beyond rational analysis? Jewish philosophy and rational faith. Jewish thinkers, often living in Islamic lands, engaged in similar debates. The most influential was Moses Maimonides, 1138 to 1204, who wrote the Guide for the Perplexed. Like Aquinas and Avicenna, Maimonides sought to reconcile revelation with Aristotelian philosophy. He insisted that God was utterly transcendent and could only be described in negative terms, saying what God is not rather than what God is. This approach aimed to protect divine mystery but also raised questions: if God could not be positively described, could human beings meaningfully know him at all? Heresy, doubt, and proto-atheism. Although open atheism was rare, accusations of heresy abounded. Figures who challenged orthodox views, such as the Cathars in southern France, or philosophers accused of overly rationalizing faith, were often branded heretics. Importantly, some medieval writers noted the possibility of outright disbelief. For example, Aquinas himself acknowledged fools who say in their heart, "There is no God," quoting Psalm 14. While rare, the concept of disbelief haunted religious thinkers, who felt compelled to address it even if few openly embraced it. The Inquisition and other church courts punished those suspected of unbelief, but these harsh measures ironically confirmed that doubt was a real undercurrent. Medieval skepticism was usually expressed in whispered conversations, anonymous tracts, or accusations rather than explicit philosophical treatises. Transmission of ideas across cultures. The medieval period was also notable for cross-cultural exchange. Works of Aristotle, preserved and translated by Muslim scholars, entered Christian Europe through Spain and Sicily. Jewish philosophers often acted as intermediaries, translating Arabic works into Hebrew and Latin. This meant that arguments about God, faith, and reason circulated widely across religious boundaries. Christian scholastics read Muslim and Jewish philosophers, while Muslim thinkers engaged with Greek and Christian thought. The debate was thus global before it was modern. Intellectual exchanges across the Mediterranean shaped the trajectory of both theism and skepticism for centuries to come. Lasting legacy. The medieval synthesis established key themes that persist in the debate between atheists and theists. Faith and reason. Can God's existence be proven rationally? Divine mystery. If God transcends human understanding, what can be said about him? Revelation versus philosophy. Which is the higher authority? Heretical doubt. What happens when belief collapses under rational scrutiny? While the Middle Ages are often caricatured as intellectually stagnant, they were in fact a period of intense philosophical creativity. By the end of the medieval era, the foundations were laid for the Renaissance and Enlightenment, when skepticism would emerge more openly and atheism would take on a sharper, more recognizable form. Part 5: The Renaissance, Humanism, Science, and Early Skepticism. The shifting intellectual landscape. The Renaissance, 14th to 17th centuries, marked a profound transformation in European thought. This period witnessed a revival of classical learning, the rise of humanism, and the beginnings of modern science. While the Middle Ages had emphasized theological synthesis and divine authority, the Renaissance celebrated human reason, creativity, and inquiry. This shift did not produce full-fledged atheism right away, but it opened intellectual space for new forms of skepticism and criticism of religious authority. The debate between believers and doubters began to move from whispered margins into more public forms. Humanism and the value of human reason. At the core of Renaissance culture was humanism, a movement that celebrated the study of classical texts, languages, and moral philosophy. Humanists such as Petrarch, Erasmus, and Giovanni Pico della Mirandola emphasized human dignity and the capacity of individuals to shape their own destiny. Pico's Oration on the Dignity of Man, 1486, sometimes called the Manifesto of the Renaissance, proclaimed that humans were unique in their freedom to rise toward the divine or fall toward the bestial. While deeply theistic, this human-centered perspective shifted emphasis from God's authority to human potential. For some, this raised questions. If humans had such freedom and dignity, what role did divine providence truly play? Could morality be grounded in human nature rather than divine command? Science as a challenge to theological authority. Another powerful force of the Renaissance was the scientific revolution in the making. Figures like Nicholas Copernicus, Galileo Galilei, and Johannes Kepler revolutionized astronomy, challenging the geocentric worldview endorsed by the Church. Copernicus's heliocentric model suggested the Earth was not the center of the cosmos. Galileo, through his telescope, discovered moons orbiting Jupiter, undermining traditional cosmology. The Church's resistance to Galileo's work symbolized the tension between scientific reason and religious authority. While these scientists were themselves believers, their discoveries discentered humanity in the cosmos and suggested that Scripture might not always align with empirical observation. This emboldened skeptics to argue that human reason and evidence should take precedence over theological claims. The Reformation and the fragmentation of Christian authority. Simultaneously, the Protestant Reformation fractured the unity of Western Christianity. Beginning with Martin Luther's 95 Theses, 1517. Reformers challenged the Catholic Church's authority, criticizing indulgences, papal power, and corruption. This schism did more than create Protestant denominations, it also weakened the monopoly of religious authority. If Catholics and Protestants could accuse each other of error, how could either claim ultimate certainty? The wars of religion that followed further disillusioned many thinkers. For some, the bloody conflicts over competing Christian truths suggested that religion was a source of division rather than truth. Early skeptics and proto-atheists. The Renaissance also saw the emergence of figures who openly flirted with radical doubt. Montaigne, a French essayist, embodied a form of skepticism that questioned human ability to know divine truth with certainty. While not an atheist, his emphasis on uncertainty laid foundations for later unbelief. Giordano Bruno, 1548–1600, was an Italian philosopher who embraced an infinite universe and rejected traditional Christian cosmology. He was burned at the stake in 1600 for heresy. Though not exactly an atheist, his rejection of orthodox doctrine was viewed as dangerously close. Anonymous tracts from the period occasionally mocked religious belief, signaling that a quiet undercurrent of outright disbelief existed. These figures represented the transition from silent doubt to vocal challenge, a dangerous move in a society where blasphemy and heresy were punishable by death. Cross-cultural encounters and religious relativism. The Renaissance was also the age of exploration. European encounters with the Americas, Asia, and Africa brought awareness of religious diversity. Travelers described societies with different gods, or no recognizable gods at all. This raised a troubling question: if so many cultures believed in different deities, could any one religion claim universal truth? The awareness of diversity planted seeds of religious relativism that fueled skepticism. The legacy of the Renaissance for the debate. The Renaissance set the stage for the modern debate between atheists and theists by elevating human reason over unquestioned authority, expanding scientific knowledge that sometimes contradicted Scripture, undermining religious unity through the Reformation, introducing skepticism as a legitimate intellectual posture, highlighting religious diversity, which made claims of exclusive truth harder to sustain. While explicit atheism was still rare and dangerous, the Renaissance opened cracks in the edifice of religious certainty. In the next era, the scientific revolution and Enlightenment, these cracks would widen into open debates about God, reason, and the nature of belief. Part 6, The Scientific Revolution, Mechanistic Universes and the Question of God. A New Vision of the Cosmos. The scientific revolution, 16th to 18th centuries, fundamentally altered the intellectual landscape of Europe. Building upon Renaissance curiosity and classical rediscoveries, it introduced a systematic method of inquiry, observation, experimentation, and mathematics that sought to uncover the laws of nature. This era marked a turning point in the debate between atheists and theists. While many of its great scientists remained believers, the mechanistic worldview they championed began to reduce the need for constant divine intervention. If the universe could be explained as a self-regulating system governed by natural laws, what role remained for God? The rise of mechanistic philosophy. The most profound change was the shift from an organic, God-centered cosmos to a mechanical, law-governed one. The world was no longer seen as a divine drama but as a machine. Predictable, measurable, and comprehensible. René Descartes, 1596–1650, introduced a dualistic framework, the physical world as a machine governed by laws, and the human soul as immaterial. His methodical doubt gave skeptics intellectual tools, even though Descartes himself argued for God's existence. Isaac Newton, 1643–1727, described universal gravitation and the laws of motion, showing that celestial and earthly phenomena followed the same mathematical principles. For some, this suggested that God was no longer needed to push the planets. Robert Boyle and other natural philosophers advanced the idea of a universe operating like a clock, God as the great clockmaker, who set things in motion. While not atheistic, these developments redefined God's role, from an active participant in daily events to a distant architect. Deism and the God of reason. One of the most significant intellectual currents to emerge was deism. Deists believed in a creator but rejected miracles, revelations, and organized religion. For them, the best evidence of God was the very order and rationality of the universe. Deists argued that religion should align with reason, not tradition or authority. Thinkers like Voltaire and Thomas Paine popularized this perspective, critiquing institutional churches while affirming a rational creator. This offered a middle ground, not atheism, but a rejection of dogma and superstition. Yet, critics noted that once God was reduced to a remote architect, it was only a short step to questioning whether such a being was necessary at all. Early modern atheism emerges. For the first time, explicit atheism began to appear in published works, though often disguised or coded to avoid persecution. Baron D. Holbach, 1723–1789, would later articulate a fully materialist worldview in the system of nature, arguing that the universe required no God. Radical thinkers circulated clandestine tracts rejecting all forms of religious belief. The rise of scientific materialism suggested that matter and motion could explain everything, without appeal to the supernatural. Although dangerous, the idea that the universe could exist without a deity at all had entered serious intellectual discourse. The clash with religious authority. The new science did not go unchallenged. The Catholic Church's trial of Galileo, 1633, became emblematic of the tension between faith and science. Galileo's support for heliocentrism clashed with scriptural interpretations, leading to his condemnation. Protestant reformers were also wary of radical science, often seeing it as undermining biblical authority. Yet both sides could not ignore the explanatory power of the new methods. The result was a polarization. Some believers saw science as revealing God's order. Others saw it as undermining divine authority. Skeptics saw it as liberation from superstition. Morality without God. The scientific revolution also revived a perennial question: could morality exist without divine command? Thinkers like Spinoza, 1632–1677, argued that ethics could be grounded in reason and human well-being rather than in obedience to God. Spinoza envisioned God not as a personal being but as identical with nature itself, a pantheistic vision that some interpreted as disguised atheism. This was a profound shift. If natural law governed the cosmos, could natural morality govern human life? Legacy of the Scientific Revolution. The scientific revolution left behind a transformed intellectual landscape. The mechanistic worldview displaced a God-centered cosmos. Deism offered belief in God without religion. Skepticism and atheism gained new intellectual legitimacy. Ethics began to be conceived in secular, rational terms. The debate between atheism and theism now had a scientific dimension. God could no longer be assumed as the default explanation for natural phenomena. Instead, his existence became a philosophical question, one that would dominate the Enlightenment, the next chapter of our series. Part 7, The Enlightenment, Reason, Religion, and Radical Critique. The Age of Reason. The Enlightenment, 17th to 18th centuries, was a transformative period in European intellectual history. Known as the Age of Reason, it sought to free human thought from the chains of superstition, dogma, and unquestioned authority. Philosophers, scientists, and writers emphasized rational inquiry, empirical evidence, and individual liberty. For the debate between atheism and belief in God, the Enlightenment was pivotal. It was the first era where open skepticism of religion became widespread among intellectuals. While many Enlightenment thinkers still affirmed God's existence, they redefined his role in ways that destabilized traditional religious authority. Enlightenment theism and deism. Deism reached its cultural peak in the Enlightenment. It allowed thinkers to affirm a rational God while rejecting organized religion. Voltaire, 1694–1778, one of the most famous Enlightenment figures, Voltaire fiercely criticized the Catholic Church for intolerance and corruption. He advocated for freedom of thought and religious tolerance, yet he maintained belief in a rational creator. His famous quip, "If God did not exist, it would be necessary to invent him," underscored his conviction that belief in a deity had social utility. Thomas Jefferson and the American founders. Across the Atlantic, many American revolutionaries embraced deism, seeing religion as valuable only insofar as it supported morality and civic order. Jefferson even created his own version of the Bible, removing miracles and supernatural events. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, 1712–1778. Though critical of institutional religion, Rousseau believed in a benevolent God and argued that religion could be a force for moral good, provided it was purified of superstition. This strain of Enlightenment thought retained belief in God but emphasized reason over revelation. Radical critiques of religion. Other Enlightenment thinkers moved closer to open atheism, advancing arguments that religion itself was irrational or harmful. Denis Diderot, 1713–1784, editor of the Encyclopédie, Diderot questioned religious dogma and leaned toward materialism. He saw religion as a human invention, often serving oppressive institutions. Baron d'Holbach, 1723–1789, one of the most outspoken atheists of the age, d'Holbach published The System of Nature, which argued that the universe was nothing more than matter in motion, governed by natural laws. God, he claimed, was an unnecessary hypothesis. David Hume, 1711–1776. The Scottish philosopher took a subtler approach, dismantling classical arguments for God. In his dialogues concerning natural religion, Hume critiqued the design argument, questioning whether the order in the universe truly implied a designer. He also raised the problem of evil in sharper terms. If God is all-powerful and benevolent, why does suffering exist? These critiques brought atheism out of the shadows and into serious philosophical debate. Religion as a tool of power. The Enlightenment also reframed religion as a socio-political institution rather than a divine truth. Philosophers like Voltaire and Diderot saw the Church as complicit in authoritarianism. Calls for freedom of conscience and separation of church and state grew louder, laying groundwork for modern secular societies. The critique of religion as a tool of oppression anticipated later thinkers such as Karl Marx, who would call religion the opium of the people. The Enlightenment shifted the conversation. Religion was no longer just about truth claims, but also about power, freedom, and human rights. The French Revolution and radical secularism. The Enlightenment reached its political climax during the French Revolution, 1789 to 1799. Revolutionaries, inspired by Enlightenment ideals, launched an unprecedented attack on the Catholic Church, which they saw as a pillar of tyranny. Churches were closed, and clergy were persecuted. Revolutionary leaders introduced the cult of reason and later the cult of the supreme being as secular or deistic alternatives to Christianity. Some revolutionaries even sought to eradicate religion entirely, a bold move that reflected the new legitimacy of atheism in political thought. Although the radical secularism of the revolution eventually gave way to compromise, it left a lasting mark on European history. The Enlightenment's legacy in the debate. The Enlightenment permanently reshaped the debate between atheists and theists. Atheism gained intellectual and social credibility, with thinkers openly rejecting God. Deism became a dominant alternative to traditional religion, affirming God but rejecting miracles and dogma. Critiques of power framed religion as a human construct, paving the way for sociological, political, and psychological critiques in later centuries. The question of morality without God became central, as thinkers argued that reason and empathy could ground ethics. Whereas the scientific revolution had raised questions about God's role in nature, the Enlightenment questioned his role in human society. The stage was now set for the 19th century, when industrialization, evolutionary theory, and political upheaval would deepen the debate even further. Part 8, the 19th Century, Darwin, Materialism, and the Rise of Secularism. A new century, a new stage of debate. The 19th century was one of the most turbulent and transformative eras in intellectual history. Scientific breakthroughs, industrialization, political revolutions, and the rise of secular philosophies reshaped the conversation between atheists and theists. For the first time, atheism moved beyond the realm of abstract philosophy and into mainstream culture, while religious defenders sought to respond with new arguments, reforms, and theological reinterpretations. The battle lines were redrawn: science versus faith, materialism versus spiritualism, progress versus tradition. Darwin and the challenge of evolution. No figure in the 19th century had a greater impact on the debate than Charles Darwin, 1809 to 1882. His landmark work, On the Origin of Species, 1859, presented a theory of evolution by natural selection that radically challenged traditional beliefs about creation. Before Darwin, many religious believers adhered to creationist accounts, with the natural world seen as evidence of God's design. The argument from design, William Paley's watchmaker analogy, was a cornerstone of Christian apologetics. After Darwin, evolution suggested that species, including humans, were not specially created, but rather the product of a natural, unguided process spanning millions of years. This had profound implications. It weakened the design argument, suggesting complexity could arise without divine intervention. It blurred the line between humans and animals, challenging religious ideas of human uniqueness. It provided a framework for scientific materialism, reducing life to natural processes rather than divine purpose. Religious defenders responded in various ways. Some rejected Darwin outright, while others embraced theistic evolution, claiming God used evolution as a tool. The rise of scientific materialism. Darwin's theory coincided with the growth of materialist philosophy. Thinkers argued that matter and natural laws explained everything, no need for God or the supernatural. Ludwig Feuerbach, 1804 to 1872. In The Essence of Christianity, Feuerbach argued that God was a projection of human desires and ideals. Religion, he said, was humanity worshipping its own essence. Karl Marx, 1818 to 1883. Deeply influenced by Feuerbach, Marx called religion the opium of the people. For Marx, religion was a tool of oppression, dulling the masses into accepting unjust social orders. His critique was less about metaphysical arguments and more about religion's role in power and economics. Friedrich Engels, 1820–1895, co-developer of Marxism, Engels reinforced the view of religion as a social construct bound to class struggle. Auguste Comte, 1798–1857, founder of positivism, Kant saw humanity progressing from religious explanations to metaphysical ones, and finally to scientific reasoning. Materialism in the 19th century reframed the atheist-theist debate in social and political terms. Religion was no longer just an intellectual error but a barrier to human progress. New defenses of religion. Theists did not retreat in silence. The 19th century also saw vigorous defenses of religion, particularly from theologians and philosophers adapting to the modern age. John Henry Newman, 1801–1890, a Catholic cardinal, Newman argued that faith was not irrational but a legitimate way of knowing. He emphasized the personal and moral dimensions of belief. Søren Kierkegaard, 1813–1855, the Danish philosopher, reacted strongly against both rationalism and institutionalized religion. He argued that faith was a passionate, subjective leap beyond reason. For Kierkegaard, faith was not about evidence but about commitment. William Ewart Gladstone, 1809–1898, a British statesman, Gladstone defended Christianity as essential for morality and civilization. These thinkers recognized that traditional proofs of God were increasingly vulnerable. Instead, they emphasized faith as an existential, moral, or spiritual necessity. Literature and the cultural debate. The debate spilled into literature and culture. Fyodor Dostoevsky, 1821–1881, explored the tension between belief and unbelief in novels like The Brothers Karamazov, where Ivan Karamazov articulates a searing critique of God based on the problem of evil. Leo Tolstoy, 1828–1910, wrestled with his own religious doubts, eventually embracing a radical form of Christianity focused on moral teachings rather than dogma. Matthew Arnold, 1822–1888, wrote poetry and essays lamenting the decline of faith in a scientific age, famously describing religion as the sea of faith retreating. Through literature, the debate was no longer confined to philosophers, it became part of everyday culture. The problem of evil revisited. The problem of evil, long a philosophical challenge, gained new urgency in the 19th century. Industrialization, political revolutions, and colonial exploitation exposed human suffering on an unprecedented scale. Critics asked, if God exists, why are poverty, war, and injustice so widespread? Was religion complicit in these evils, by justifying oppressive systems? This sharpened the atheist critique, while theists responded with new theodicies, arguing that suffering could deepen moral character, test faith, or be explained by human free will. Secularization of society. Perhaps the greatest legacy of the 19th century was secularization. While religion remained dominant in many areas, secular institutions grew stronger. Public education increasingly emphasized science over theology. Secular governments began separating from churches, especially in Europe. Urbanization weakened traditional religious communities. By the century's end, atheism and agnosticism were no longer fringe positions, they were part of the mainstream intellectual landscape. Legacy of the 19th century debate. The 19th century reshaped the atheist-theist debate in enduring ways. Science became central, with Darwin's theory providing atheism with powerful empirical backing. Materialism expanded, interpreting religion as a human construct tied to psychology, sociology, and economics. Theistic responses diversified, moving away from rational proofs toward existential and moral defenses of faith. Secularization accelerated, shifting the debate from individual belief to societal structures. The stage was now set for the 20th century, where world wars, existentialist philosophy, psychology, and advances in science would push the debate into new and even more radical directions. Part 9, The Early 20th Century, War, Existentialism, and the Crisis of Faith. A century begins in turmoil. The early 20th century opened with optimism about science, progress, and human achievement. Advances in medicine, technology, and communication seemed to herald a new age of reason. Yet within a few decades, this optimism collapsed under the weight of 2 world wars, economic depression, and political totalitarianism. For the debate between atheism and belief in God, this period was pivotal. Many saw the devastation of the wars as proof of a world without divine order, while others clung to faith more tightly in search of meaning amid chaos. Intellectual movements like existentialism, psychoanalysis, and logical positivism reshaped the discussion, creating new challenges for believers and new ways of expressing unbelief. World War I and the shattering of illusions. The First World War, 1914 to 1918, marked a turning point in the spiritual landscape of Europe. Millions died in mechanized slaughter, and the horrors of trench warfare undermined confidence in traditional religious answers. Soldiers and civilians alike asked, if God is good and powerful, how could he allow this? Churches often supported national war efforts, leaving many disillusioned with institutional religion. The lost generation of writers, like Eric Maria Remarque, All Quiet on the Western Front, and Wilfred Owen, captured the despair and sense of meaninglessness that followed. The Great War planted deep doubts about divine providence, reinforcing the problem of evil in modern terms. Existentialism and the search for meaning. Amid the disillusionment, existentialist philosophy rose to prominence, tackling the human struggle for meaning in a seemingly indifferent universe. Jean-Paul Sartre, 1905 to 1980, declared that existence precedes essence. Without God, humans are condemned to be free, responsible for creating their own values. Sartre embraced atheism as liberation from illusions of divine authority. Albert Camus, 1913 to 1960, though not strictly an atheist, Camus described the world as absurd, without inherent meaning. In works like The Myth of Sisyphus, he argued that humans must confront absurdity without retreating to God. Martin Heidegger, 1889 to 1976, explored being and mortality, emphasizing the need for authentic existence. Though not a straightforward atheist, Heidegger's thought influenced secular existentialism. On the other side, Gabriel Marcel, 1889 to 1973, and Karl Jaspers, 1883 to 1969, defended a theistic existentialism, arguing that meaning is found through transcendence and faith. Paul Tillich, 1886 to 1965, redefined God not as a being, but as the ground of being, seeking to preserve religious language in a secular world. Existentialism thus embodied the 20th century's crisis: without God, can life have meaning? Freud and the psychology of religion. The rise of psychoanalysis introduced new critiques of faith. Sigmund Freud, 1856 to 1939, in works like The Future of an Illusion, 1927, argued that religion was a psychological projection, an infantile need for security and a father figure. For Freud, belief in God was wish fulfillment. He compared religious rituals to neuroses, suggesting they were rooted in unconscious fears and desires. Freud's critiques were devastating to traditional apologetic because they reframed religion as psychological necessity, not objective truth. Meanwhile, his student Carl Jung, 1875 to 1961, took a different path, interpreting religion as an expression of the collective unconscious. For Jung, myths and symbols had real psychological value, even if not literally true. Logical positivism and the rejection of metaphysics. In philosophy, the Vienna Circle, 1920s-30s, pioneered logical positivism, which claimed that only statements verifiable through science or logic were meaningful. Metaphysical claims like God exists or God loves humanity were dismissed as nonsensical, since they could not be empirically tested. Thinkers like A.J. Ayer, 1910 to 1989, popularized this view in his book Language, Truth, and Logic, 1936. This created a powerful intellectual current. The debate was no longer just whether God was real, but whether talk of God had any meaning at all. The Holocaust and the radical problem of evil. The Second World War, 1939 to 1945, and especially the Holocaust intensified the crisis of faith. The systematic extermination of 6 million Jews in Nazi death camps left theologians and believers with a staggering question. Where was God at Auschwitz? This question reshaped Jewish and Christian theology alike. Some concluded that God was silent, absent, or even non-existent. Others, like Elie Wiesel, struggled with faith after Auschwitz, capturing the tension between despair and devotion. Theologians like Richard Rubinstein argued that the Holocaust made belief in the traditional God impossible. The Holocaust permanently altered the atheist-theist debate by giving the problem of evil a horrifying modern example. New theological responses. Despite the rise of secular critiques, religious thinkers sought to reframe faith in modern terms. Karl Barth, 1886 to 1968, emphasized revelation and God's otherness, rejecting attempts to prove God through reason. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, 1906 to 1945, executed by the Nazis, developed a theology of the suffering God who shares in human pain. Reinhold Niebuhr, 1892 to 1971, argued for Christian realism, acknowledging human sinfulness and the limits of reason. These responses highlighted that religion, far from fading away, was reinventing itself to address modern challenges. Legacy of the early 20th century debate. The early 20th century left the debate transformed. World wars shattered religious optimism, giving atheism new urgency. Existentialism reframed the issue around human freedom, meaning, and authenticity. Freud and psychology reduced religion to a projection of human needs. Logical positivism dismissed theology as meaningless. The Holocaust intensified the problem of evil, forcing believers into new theological positions. Faith and unbelief were now seen less as abstract doctrines and more as existential stances in a fractured, uncertain world. Part 10, the Mid-20th Century, Cold War, Humanism, and the Expansion of Atheism. A post-war world of ideological polarization. After the Second World War, the world entered a period defined by the Cold War, 1947 to 1991, a geopolitical struggle between the capitalist West, led by the United States, and the communist East, led by the Soviet Union. This rivalry profoundly shaped the debate over atheism and belief in God. In the Soviet bloc, atheism was not just a personal philosophy but state doctrine. Religion was often suppressed, churches closed, and clergy persecuted. The official Marxist-Leninist position held that religion was an opiate, a tool of oppression. In the United States, religion became a defining marker of cultural identity. In God We Trust was added to currency, 1956, and Under God was inserted into the Pledge of Allegiance, 1954, as symbolic opposition to atheistic communism. This ideological battle sharpened the lines between faith and unbelief, framing atheism as subversive in the West, while in the East, it was enforced as a sign of political loyalty. Secular humanism and the rise of modern atheism. Alongside Cold War tensions, a new intellectual and cultural movement emerged, secular humanism. Unlike state-enforced atheism, secular humanism presented a positive vision of life without God. In the United States, groups like the American Humanist Association promoted a worldview grounded in reason, science, and ethics without religion. The Humanist Manifesto, 1933, and later Humanist Manifesto II, 1973, articulated this stance: humans can live moral, meaningful lives without reference to the divine. Thinkers like Bertrand Russell, 1872 to 1970, and Julian Huxley, 1887 to 1975, became prominent advocates of this perspective. Russell, in particular, was one of the century's most famous atheists. His essay Why I Am Not a Christian, 1927, was widely read and influenced generations of skeptics. He rejected traditional arguments for God's existence, arguing instead for a life based on intellectual honesty and compassion without illusions. Theology in response, neo-orthodoxy and beyond. Religious thinkers, however, did not remain silent. In fact, the mid-20th century was a period of theological renewal and reinvention. Karl Barth had already challenged liberal theology with his emphasis on divine revelation, but his influence continued to shape post-war Christianity. Reinhold Niebuhr, with his Christian realism, addressed social ethics, warning against both secular utopianism and naive religious optimism. Catholic thinkers like Henri de Lubac and Jacques Maritain revived interest in Christian humanism, attempting to offer a religious alternative to secular humanism. At the same time, existentialist theology, influenced by Kierkegaard and brought into the mid-20th century by Paul Tillich and Rudolf Bultmann, tried to engage modern doubts head-on. Bultmann's program of demythologization sought to reinterpret the Bible without supernatural elements, aligning Christianity with modern existential thought. Science, technology, and the space age. The mid-20th century also saw explosive growth in science and technology, reshaping the conversation about God. The discovery of DNA structure, 1953, advancements in physics, and the dawn of the space age in 1957 expanded human understanding of the universe. Some saw these developments as evidence of human autonomy, reducing the need for religious explanations. The famous quote attributed to Soviet cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin, "I looked and looked but didn't see God," captured this sentiment, though it may be apocryphal. On the other hand, Christian thinkers like C.S. Lewis used literature and apologetic to defend belief, arguing that science alone could not satisfy the human search for meaning. His books Mere Christianity, 1952, and The Problem of Pain, 1940, became classics of modern apologetic. Science did not resolve the debate, it gave both sides new material. For atheists, it reinforced naturalism. For theists, it inspired renewed arguments for a creator behind the cosmos. Post-Holocaust theology and the question of God's silence. As discussed in Part 9, the Holocaust left theology in crisis. In the mid-20th century, this crisis deepened into sustained theological reflection on evil and suffering. Jewish thinkers like Emil Fackenheim insisted that faith must survive Auschwitz, arguing that abandoning Judaism would hand Hitler a posthumous victory. Christian theologians wrestled with theodicy in light of modern atrocities, often emphasizing God's solidarity with human suffering rather than his omnipotent control. This period produced a more humble, self-critical faith, one that acknowledged human sin and God's apparent hiddenness, yet sought meaning in survival, resilience, and hope. Atheism and literature. The debate also flourished in literature and art. Writers like George Orwell, 1984, Animal Farm, criticized both political oppression and religious hypocrisy, while others, like Ayn Rand, championed a radical atheistic individualism. Meanwhile, authors such as Flannery O'Connor and Graham Greene explored the persistence of faith amid doubt, portraying characters torn between belief and unbelief in a morally ambiguous world. Art and literature thus became arenas where atheism and theism clashed indirectly, through narrative and imagination rather than formal argument. The expansion of atheism. By mid-century, atheism had moved from being a minority intellectual position to a global ideological force. In the Soviet Union and Eastern Bloc, atheism was enforced by law. In the West, secular humanism, philosophy, and literature advanced the case for unbelief. Globally, atheism became increasingly tied to modernity, science, and political identity, while religion often aligned with tradition and cultural heritage. This period set the stage for the later "God is dead" movement, the rise of secularization theories, and the eventual pushback by religious revivals in the late 20th century. Legacy of the mid-20th century debate. By the 1960s, the atheist-believer debate had become deeply intertwined with politics, science, and culture. Cold War divisions politicized atheism and faith, associating them with competing ideologies. Secular humanism provided a moral framework without God, challenging believers to justify religious ethics. Theology adapted, shifting from triumphalist claims to more existential and humble approaches. Science and technology expanded human horizons, intensifying debates about whether God was necessary. Literature and philosophy gave voice to doubt, showing the cultural penetration of unbelief. The debate was far from settled. If anything, the stage was now set for even sharper confrontations in the 1960s and 1970s, as counterculture movements, liberation theology, and radical atheism redefined the conversation. Part 11, the 1960s-70s, the God is Dead movement, counterculture, and new religious thought. A cultural earthquake. The 1960s and 1970s were decades of profound cultural change. Civil rights movements, second-wave feminism, the Vietnam War, the rise of youth counterculture, and a wave of anti-establishment sentiment. Religion and atheism were caught up in this cultural earthquake. For many, traditional Christianity seemed outdated, tied to authority structures that youth were rebelling against. At the same time, the counterculture explored spirituality in new ways, Eastern religions, mysticism, and even psychedelic experiences. In academia, radical theology emerged, famously captured in the phrase, God is dead. This period marked both a crisis of faith and an explosion of new spiritual experimentation. The God is Dead movement. The phrase God is dead originally came from Friedrich Nietzsche in the 19th century, but in the 1960s, it was revived by a group of radical theologians. Thomas J. Altizer, William Hamilton, and Paul Van Buren became known as the Death of God theologians. They argued that traditional conceptions of God no longer spoke to modern humanity. For Altizer, the death of God was not just cultural decline but a theological truth. God had poured himself into the world through Christ and no longer existed as a transcendent being. Time magazine's 1966 cover story, Is God Dead?, brought the debate into mainstream culture. This was not atheism in the Soviet sense, but rather a radical rethinking of Christianity for the modern age. Still, it reinforced for many the sense that faith was waning. Atheism in the public sphere. Alongside radical theology, atheism gained new visibility. Philosophers such as J.L. Mackie, The Miracle of Theism, 1982, provided rigorous arguments against God's existence. Public intellectuals like Bertrand Russell, who passed in 1970, remained touchstones for rationalist critiques of religion. Secular organizations, including the newly formed American Atheists led by Madalyn Murray O'Hair, became more outspoken. O'Hair, who successfully challenged mandatory school prayer in Engel versus Vitale, 1962, and Abington versus Schempp, 1963, became a lightning rod for debates about secularism. Atheism was no longer just a quiet philosophical position, it was increasingly part of the public battle over education, law, and cultural identity. Counterculture spiritualities. While atheism expanded, the counterculture did not fully embrace unbelief. Instead, many young people rejected organized religion but sought alternative spiritualities. Eastern religions such as Hinduism and Buddhism attracted Western interest. The Beatles famously studied with the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi in India, and Buddhist teachers like Thich Nhat Hanh spread mindfulness practices to the West. New Age spirituality blended astrology, meditation, and self-discovery. Psychedelics were seen as a doorway to transcendent experiences, championed by figures like Timothy Leary. This complicated the debate. Rather than a simple choice between atheism and traditional belief, many embraced pluralism and experimentation. Liberation theology. At the same time, in Latin America and elsewhere, a new Christian movement emerged, liberation theology. Thinkers like Gustavo Gutierrez in Peru argued that theology must respond to the suffering of the poor and oppressed. Liberation theology fused Christian faith with Marxist social critique, alarming both the Vatican and conservative governments. It reframed the debate by insisting that the question was not simply whether God exists, but what kind of God believers serve, a God of the status quo or a God of liberation. For atheists, liberation theology showed that religion could still be socially powerful. For believers, it was proof that faith could adapt and remain relevant. Feminist theology and atheism. The feminist movement also reshaped the landscape. Many feminists criticized traditional religion as patriarchal and oppressive. Thinkers like Mary Daly argued that, if God is male, then male is God. Daly eventually abandoned Christianity for a form of feminist spirituality. Others, like Rosemary Radford Ruether, sought to reform Christianity from within, developing feminist theology. This created new forms of religious thought but also aligned some strands of feminism with secularism and atheism. Science and cosmology. Scientific discoveries in the 1960s and 70s also fueled debate. The development of Big Bang cosmology seemed to suggest a cosmic beginning, which some believers used as evidence for creation. Others argued that science explained the universe without the need for God, continuing the trend of scientific naturalism. Advances in evolutionary biology, particularly through thinkers like Stephen Jay Gould, reinforced Darwinian explanations and countered religious claims about design. The stage was being set for the science versus religion debates that would explode in the late 20th century. Summary of the era. The 1960s, 70s brought dramatic shifts in the atheist-believer debate. The God is dead movement challenged both believers and atheists to rethink categories. Atheism gained visibility in law, politics, and public discourse. Counterculture spirituality diversified the conversation beyond simple belief/unbelief. Liberation theology and feminist theology redefined religious engagement with justice and gender. Science continued to expand naturalistic explanations, sparking new debates. This era revealed that the debate over God was no longer confined to ivory towers, it was now a cultural, political, and global phenomenon. Part 12, The Late 20th Century, Secularization, Postmodernism, and Religious Revivals. The Secularization Thesis. In the mid-20th century, many sociologists predicted that religion would steadily decline as societies modernized. This idea became known as the secularization thesis. The logic was simple. Modern science would provide answers once sought from religion. Industrialization and urbanization would weaken traditional religious communities. Rationalism, democracy, and education would erode faith. Thinkers like Peter Berger and Brian Wilson argued that the more modern a society became, the less religious it would be. In much of Western Europe, declining church attendance seemed to confirm the theory. But as the century progressed, cracks began to appear in this prediction. Religion did not vanish. In some places, it even resurged. The rise of secular humanism. While secularization theory was unfolding, secular humanism grew into a recognized worldview. The Humanist Manifesto 2, 1973, outlined a life philosophy without God, emphasizing reason, ethics, and human flourishing. Humanist organizations promoted morality without theism, arguing that meaning could be found in human creativity, science, and compassion. Public debates around secular humanism intensified, especially in the U.S., where critics painted it as a substitute religion being smuggled into schools and politics. This brought atheism and humanism into sharper focus in the culture wars that would dominate the late 20th century. Postmodernism and the end of metanarratives. While secular humanism offered a confident, rationalist worldview, postmodernism emerged in the humanities, complicating both atheist and religious perspectives. Jean-François Lyotard declared that postmodernity meant the end of grand narratives, overarching stories, including both the Christian narrative of salvation and the secular narrative of inevitable progress. Michel Foucault analyzed how institutions of power shape truth, including religious authority. Jacques Derrida questioned certainty itself, applying deconstruction to texts, including scripture. For believers, postmodernism undermined the stability of dogma. For atheists, it also destabilized rationalist confidence. The debate shifted. It was no longer just, is God real, but, how do we know anything with certainty? Religious revivals. Even as secularization was predicted, religion staged major revivals. Evangelical Christianity grew in the U.S., fueled by televangelism, megachurches, and leaders like Billy Graham. The Pentecostal movement, emphasizing spiritual gifts and charismatic worship, exploded globally, especially in Latin America, Africa, and Asia. Islamic revival movements emerged across the Muslim world, challenging secular regimes and Western influence. The 1979 Iranian Revolution exemplified this resurgence. In Catholicism, Pope John Paul II inspired millions, becoming a powerful global voice for faith in the modern world. These revivals challenged the secularization thesis directly. Rather than fading, religion adapted and reasserted itself. The culture wars. In the U.S., the late 20th century saw religion and atheism clash in what became known as the culture wars. School prayer and creation versus evolution debates reignited. Legal battles emerged over abortion, sex education, and public funding for religious schools. Religious conservatives argued that secularism was eroding morality, while secularists countered that religion was imposing itself on public life. Atheism, once largely confined to philosophy, became more politicized, tied to debates over law, education, and civil rights. New atheist precursors. Although the New Atheism of Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens would not fully arrive until the 2000s, the intellectual groundwork was laid in this period. Antony Flew developed influential arguments about falsifiability and the burden of proof in religious claims. Paul Kurtz, a philosopher and founder of the Council for Secular Humanism, popularized atheism as part of a constructive humanist worldview. Popular science communicators like Carl Sagan promoted awe and wonder through the lens of science, offering naturalistic alternatives to religious explanations. These figures set the stage for the atheism versus belief debates of the 21st century. Summary of the era. The late 20th century was not the death of God but rather a time of profound transformation in the debate. Secularization theory suggested religion was fading, but religious revivals proved otherwise. Secular humanism provided a confident atheist worldview rooted in reason and ethics. Postmodernism destabilized certainty, complicating both the atheist and believer positions. Religious revivals in Christianity, Islam, and beyond showed that belief remained potent. The culture wars politicized the debate, embedding it into education, law, and public life. The stage was now set for the explosive confrontations of the early 21st century, when atheism and religion would meet head-on in an increasingly global, digital, and polarized world. Part 13, The Early 21st Century, The New Atheism and Global Religious Countercurrents. The shock of 9/11 and the context for new atheism. The early 21st century began with a transformative event that redefined global politics and the religious debate, the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001. For many in the West, 9/11 became evidence of the dangers of religious extremism. The attackers invoked Islam in justifying their actions, which fueled widespread debates about the role of religion in violence. Into this atmosphere stepped a new wave of atheist voices who argued that religion itself, not just extremism, was inherently dangerous. This movement would soon be known as the New Atheism. The Four Horsemen of New Atheism. The movement was spearheaded by four public intellectuals often referred to as the Four Horsemen of New Atheism. Richard Dawkins, biologist and author of The God Delusion, 2006, Dawkins argued that belief in God was a delusion harmful to rational thought and progress. Christopher Hitchens, journalist and author of God is Not Great, 2007, Hitchens contended that religion poisons everything, perpetuating violence, ignorance, and oppression. Sam Harris, philosopher and neuroscientist, author of The End of Faith, 2004, who claimed that religious faith was incompatible with a peaceful and rational world. Daniel Dennett, philosopher, author of Breaking the Spell, 2006, who analyzed religion as a natural phenomenon shaped by evolution, psychology, and culture. These figures were not the first atheists, but they were unique in their public militancy, arguing that religion was not just wrong but actively harmful. The spread of new atheism online. The rise of the internet gave new atheism a massive platform. Blogs, forums, and YouTube became spaces where atheists gathered to critique religion and share secular arguments. Websites like Reddit's r/atheism and Pharyngula, P.Z. Meyer's blog, grew large followings. Debates between atheists and believers were recorded and shared widely, reaching millions of viewers. Memes and online campaigns framed atheism as modern, rational, and intellectually superior, often contrasting it with depictions of religious dogma. The Internet, ironically created by many individuals from secular and religious backgrounds alike, became a battleground for belief versus non-belief. Religious countercurrents. While new atheism spread rapidly, religion also responded with renewed vigor. Christian apologetic revival, thinkers like William Lane Craig, Alvin Plantinga, and Tim Keller published works defending Christianity using philosophical and cultural arguments. Debates between Craig and Dawkins/Hitchens became iconic moments in the religion-atheism clash. Interfaith alliances. In response to new atheist criticisms, many religious groups emphasized shared values such as compassion, community, and social justice, arguing that atheism could not replace these. Islamic voices. Muslim scholars defended Islam against charges of extremism, pointing out Western misinterpretations. They argued that new atheists unfairly generalized from terrorism to religion as a whole. Global South Christianity. Christianity continued to expand rapidly in Africa, Latin America, and Asia, offering a stark contrast to secular trends in Europe. Cultural polarization. The debate between atheists and believers became intertwined with broader cultural divides. In the U.S., religion and politics were deeply entangled, with the rise of the religious right on one hand and an increasingly outspoken secular left on the other. In Europe, debates over Islam, immigration, and secular identity were shaped by the backdrop of terrorism and multiculturalism. Globally, clashes over blasphemy laws, freedom of expression, and religious freedom highlighted the tension between sacred belief and secular modernity. Atheists argued that secularism was necessary for peace, while believers countered that secularism itself could lead to nihilism, consumerism, and moral collapse. Criticisms of new atheism. Though influential, new atheism faced criticisms from multiple directions. Too strident, critics argued that Dawkins and Hitchens painted religion with too broad a brush, ignoring nuances and moderate believers. Eurocentric bias. Many noted that new atheism focused heavily on Christianity and Islam in Western contexts, neglecting non-Western religious traditions. Philosophical shallowness. Philosophers like Terry Eagleton and John Gray accused new atheists of engaging with folk religion rather than sophisticated theology. Alienating tone. Some argued that mocking believers did little to advance dialogue and instead hardened divisions. By the late 2010s, the new atheist movement had lost some of its cultural dominance, but it had already reshaped the terms of the debate. Summary of the era. The early 21st century saw the debate between atheists and believers reach a new intensity. 9/11 and terrorism made religion appear dangerous to many, sparking atheistic critiques. New atheism emerged with Dawkins, Hitchens, Harris, and Dennett leading the charge. The Internet amplified atheism, creating a global community of skeptics and critics. Religious countercurrents, from apologetic to global revival movements, pushed back. The debate became polarized, tied to broader political and cultural conflicts. New atheism's limitations and criticisms revealed the complexity of the debate. The result was a world in which atheism was more visible and vocal than ever before, but also one in which religion proved resilient, adaptive, and deeply embedded in human culture. Part 14, Interfaith Dialogue, Science versus Religion, and the Changing Landscape of Belief in the 2010s. The decline of new atheism's cultural dominance. By the early 2010s, the shock factor of new atheism began to wane. While Dawkins, Harris, Hitchens, and Dennett had energized a new generation of skeptics, their movement faced criticism for being too combative and reductionist. The passing of Christopher Hitchens in 2011 symbolized both the high point and decline of the movement. Without his charisma and rhetorical fire, New Atheism seemed less culturally potent. Meanwhile, religious traditions adapted and found ways to re-engage public discourse, not simply by attacking atheism but by focusing on dialogue, community, and shared values. Interfaith dialogue as a counter-movement. A striking trend of the 2010s was the rise of interfaith dialogue. Rather than framing atheism as the enemy, many religious groups sought to bridge divides. Christian, Jewish, and Muslim leaders collaborated on issues of social justice, poverty, and climate change. The Parliament of the World's Religions, revived in the late 20th century, grew in prominence, promoting global cooperation among faiths. In some cases, atheists were invited into interfaith conversations, reframing the debate less as a battle and more as a collaboration on shared moral concerns. This shift suggested that religion's defense was not just intellectual but also communal and practical, offering meaning, belonging, and action in ways atheism struggled to replicate. Science versus religion in the public eye. While the 19th and 20th century saw science and religion locked in a battle over Darwinism and cosmology, the 2010s saw a more nuanced dynamic. 1. The ongoing evolution debate. In the U.S., public disputes over evolution versus creationism remained lively, particularly in conservative regions. Legal battles over teaching intelligent design in schools resurfaced, though courts consistently ruled in favor of secular science curricula. 2. Cosmology and physics. Discoveries in cosmology, such as the Higgs boson, 2012, fueled atheist arguments about a self-sufficient universe. Believers countered with the fine-tuning argument, suggesting the universe's constants implied design rather than chance. 3. Neuroscience and consciousness. Atheists like Sam Harris argued that neuroscience could explain morality and consciousness without God. Religious thinkers countered that subjective experience, free will, and meaning pointed beyond materialism. 4. Climate change and environmentalism. A new front opened in science and religion, climate change. Religious leaders, including Pope Francis with his encyclical Laudato Si, 2015, framed environmental care as a moral duty. Atheists emphasized secular science-based solutions, but the debate highlighted an area where religious and secular voices could converge. The Internet and the fragmentation of debate. The Internet, which had amplified New Atheism, also fragmented it. By the mid-2010s, YouTube atheists gained large followings but often shifted toward broader political commentary, sometimes drifting into controversies about feminism, free speech, and identity politics. Social media algorithms pushed debates into echo chambers, where atheists and believers largely argued within insulated communities rather than engaging each other directly. Podcasting emerged as a new medium for long-form dialogue. Figures like Sam Harris debated Jordan Peterson, William Lane Craig, and others in ways that were more nuanced than viral soundbites. Shifting global religious landscape. While Western Europe saw steady secularization, religion continued to thrive globally. Africa, Christianity and Islam both grew rapidly, often in charismatic and Pentecostal forms. Asia, China officially remained atheist but saw rising interest in traditional Confucian, Buddhist, and folk practices. Middle East, religion remained deeply central, though underground atheist movements began to surface online. United States, the knowns, those claiming no religious affiliation, grew to nearly a quarter of the population by the late 2010s, reshaping the American religious landscape. This paradox, declining religiosity in some areas and rapid growth in others, meant that the debate between atheism and belief was never one-size-fits-all. Philosophical developments. The 2010s also saw continued philosophical sophistication on both sides. Atheist philosophers like Graham Oppy developed more nuanced arguments for naturalism, moving beyond the polemics of Dawkins. Theistic philosophers like Alvin Plantinga, with his evolutionary argument against naturalism, and William Lane Craig sharpened cosmological and moral arguments for God. Public intellectuals like Jordan Peterson defended religion less as literal truth than as a mythic framework necessary for meaning and order, challenging both strict atheism and dogmatic religion. Summary of the era. The 2010s were a time of diversification and dialogue in the atheism versus religion debate. New atheism's sharp edge dulled, and its cultural dominance declined. Interfaith and secular collaborations emphasized shared ethical challenges. Science-religion debates moved beyond Darwin, into cosmology, neuroscience, and climate ethics. The internet fragmented the debate into echo chambers but also enabled new long-form dialogues. Globally, religion declined in some regions but thrived in others, complicating predictions of inevitable secularization. Philosophical debates deepened, with both sides refining arguments beyond earlier polemics. The result was not the disappearance of the debate but its evolution into new arenas, shaped by global politics, technology, and cultural change. Part 15, The Rise of Post-Secularism, Spiritual but Not Religious Movements, and the New Face of the Debate in the 2020s. From secularization to post-secularism. By the 2020s, the prediction that secularization would steadily erase religion looked increasingly simplistic. While many Western societies had seen declining formal religious affiliation, religion did not vanish. Instead, scholars began speaking of a post-secular age, a time when religion, atheism, and hybrid spiritualities coexist in complex, overlapping ways. Jürgen Habermas, a German philosopher once firmly secular, began using the term post-secular to describe societies where religion remained publicly relevant, requiring dialogue between secular and religious citizens. Instead of seeing atheism as triumphant or religion as dominant, post-secular thought emphasized pluralism, a patchwork of belief systems negotiating meaning side by side. This shift reframed the debate, not which side will win, but how do multiple frameworks of meaning coexist in a globalized world? The rise of the spiritual but not religious, SBNR. A major trend of the 2020s has been the explosion of people identifying as spiritual but not religious. These individuals often reject organized religion but embrace practices like meditation, yoga, astrology, mindfulness, or eclectic blends of traditions. Surveys show that younger generations, particularly millennials and Gen Z, increasingly identify as knowns, no formal affiliation, but still believe in some form of higher power, energy, or cosmic order. For atheists, this presented a new challenge. It was no longer just about debating traditional doctrines of Christianity or Islam, but about addressing diffuse, experiential, and individualized spiritualities that resist rational critique. For believers, it represented both a threat and an opportunity. Traditional institutions lost members, but spirituality remained alive, pointing to a deep human longing for transcendence. Science, technology, and the search for meaning. The 2020s also saw new intersections between science, technology, and faith. 1. Artificial intelligence and transcendence. Advances in AI and biotechnology sparked existential debates. Could machines ever be conscious? Some atheists argued that human uniqueness is illusory, that intelligence itself can emerge from material processes. Some believers suggested that AI highlights the uniqueness of the human soul, or even speculated about God working through technology. 2. Space exploration and cosmic awe. Renewed interest in space exploration, especially with private companies like SpaceX, rekindled discussions about humanity's place in the cosmos. Atheists pointed to cosmic scale as evidence of human insignificance. Believers countered with awe-inspired theology, suggesting vastness itself is a sign of divine creativity. 3. Neuroscience of religion. Continued study of neural correlates of spiritual experience suggested that prayer, meditation, and mystical visions can be explained biologically. Critics of atheism argued that a neurological basis for spirituality does not negate meaning, it may instead show how humans are wired for God. Global political shifts and religion. the debate between atheism and faith in the 2020s cannot be separated from global politics. The Middle East. While secularism remained suppressed in many countries, underground atheist movements flourished online. At the same time, religious revivalism persisted, shaping political identity and resistance. The West. In the United States, political divides often mapped onto religious divides, with atheists skewing progressive and evangelical Christians aligning with conservatism. Debates about abortion, LGBTQ rights, and religious freedom framed the God question in practical, political terms. Asia and Africa. Religion remained deeply influential, but in some areas, rising education and urbanization encouraged critical questioning. New atheist voices began emerging in India, Nigeria, and beyond, creating debates in cultural contexts far from Europe's historical battles. The New Atheist Legacy Reconsidered. In the 2020s, the legacy of New Atheism underwent re-evaluation. Critics within atheism argued that the movement's focus on mocking religion failed to provide a positive vision for meaning, community, or ethics. Some atheists shifted towards secular humanism, emphasizing compassion, human rights, and social justice as replacements for religious morality. Meanwhile, religious defenders adapted, making more nuanced arguments, less about dogma and more about existential need, narrative, and resilience. The conversation became less about proving or disproving God's existence in a strict sense, and more about what kind of world we want to live in, and whether a secular framework can sustain deep human needs. COVID-19 and the search for certainty. The global pandemic, 2020 to 2022, sharpened these debates. For some, the crisis underscored reliance on science, medicine, and human ingenuity, strengthening atheistic or secular worldviews. For others, the pandemic deepened spiritual reflection. Religious communities provided comfort, ritual, and meaning in a time of uncertainty. Online religious services boomed, as did online atheist and secular support groups, showing both sides adapting to a digital, globalized crisis. The pandemic highlighted the enduring human need for narrative frameworks of suffering, hope, and resilience, whether religious or secular. Summary of the era. Part 15 highlights how the debate entered a new phase in the 2020s. The concept of post-secularism reframed the debate as coexistence rather than victory. The rise of the spiritual but not religious made belief more diffuse and harder to debate. Science and technology added new layers: AI, neuroscience, and space exploration. Political and cultural contexts kept the debate globally diverse. New atheism's sharp edge dulled, giving way to more nuanced secular humanism. The pandemic emphasized how both atheists and believers grapple with uncertainty, meaning, and mortality. Part 16, Philosophical Shifts, Moral Frameworks Without God, and the Ongoing Relevance of Faith. Morality without God, the central question. One of the oldest and most enduring debates between atheists and theists is the question of morality. Can human beings construct binding ethical systems without belief in God, or does morality ultimately depend on divine authority? Atheist perspective, morality can be grounded in human reason, empathy, evolutionary biology, or social contracts. Thinkers like Jeremy Bentham, John Stuart Mill, and modern secular ethicists argue that human flourishing, not divine command, can form the basis of right and wrong. Theist perspective, believers often argue that morality without God is unstable, subjective, or reducible to preference. The famous Euthyphro dilemma, is something good because God commands it, or does God command it because it is good, still sparks lively discussion. By the 21st century, this debate had evolved into practical discussions about justice, human rights, and global ethics. Secular humanism and ethical naturalism. Secular humanism rose as one of the strongest attempts to provide morality without divine reference. Its central tenets include human dignity. Every human has intrinsic worth, not because of divine creation, but because of shared humanity. Reason and science. Ethical progress emerges through rational inquiry, not revelation. Empathy and solidarity. cooperation, compassion, and shared well-being can serve as moral foundations. Freedom and democracy. Ethics thrive in societies that respect individual rights and promote equality. This framework appealed to atheists seeking not just critique of religion but a positive vision for living well. It was formalized through organizations like the American Humanist Association and the International Humanist and Ethical Union. However, critics argued secular humanism cannot inspire ultimate sacrifice or provide transcendent grounding for morality, an area where faith still seemed to offer something deeper. Moral philosophy in the 21st century. Contemporary philosophers expanded this debate. Moral realists without God, such as Derek Parfit, argued that objective moral truths exist, even in a godless universe. For example, suffering is bad, is universally true, regardless of religion. Moral anti-realists argued that morality is ultimately constructed by humans, meaning good and evil are flexible and context-dependent. Theists responded by highlighting that secular moral frameworks often borrow from religious traditions, such as human rights concepts, which some argue have roots in Judeo-Christian values. Thus, morality remains a central battlefield where atheists and believers wrestle with how to justify ethical obligations. The ongoing relevance of faith. Despite secular advances, faith has remained powerful because it provides narratives of meaning. Religion offers stories of origin, destiny, and purpose that extend beyond individual life. Community and ritual. Believers find belonging and shared identity through worship, holidays, and sacred traditions. Transcendent grounding. Faith ties morality and meaning to something beyond shifting human consensus. Hope in suffering. Belief in God or afterlife promises consolation in the face of death, tragedy, and injustice. Atheists often counter that these needs can be met through art, philosophy, community, or science. Yet faith persists because it offers existential security that secular frameworks sometimes lack. Shifts in public debates. In the 2010s, debates about morality increasingly appeared in public discourse rather than just philosophy classrooms. Bioethics, issues like cloning, genetic editing, and euthanasia often split along religious/secular lines. Social justice. Some atheists and believers found common cause in fighting for equality and human rights, though they disagreed on the philosophical basis. Climate change. Many religious leaders framed environmental care as stewardship of God's creation, while atheists argued for ecological ethics rooted in sustainability. Thus, while disagreements persisted, the lines blurred as both camps sought to shape a moral vision for humanity. Why this debate still matters. Part 16 shows that the God question is not just about metaphysics, but about how humans ought to live. Atheists push for frameworks of ethics without transcendence. Believers argue that morality is fragile without ultimate grounding. Both sides adapt to changing global challenges, from AI to climate to human rights. The debate remains alive because it addresses not only whether God exists, but whether humanity can find binding, meaningful, and enduring moral order in a world that often feels uncertain. Part 17, the role of Eastern thought, comparative religion, and global atheisms in the debate. Introduction. While much of the atheist-theist debate has historically centered on the Western philosophical and religious tradition, Christianity, Judaism, Islam versus secular humanism, materialism, and rationalism, the conversation is not limited to Europe and North America. In Part 17, we expand the scope to include Eastern thought, comparative religion, and the many forms of global atheisms that shape the conversation differently across cultures. Atheism and belief in Eastern traditions. Unlike Western monotheistic religions, many Eastern traditions do not posit a personal creator God in the same way. This changes the contours of the debate. Hinduism and atheism. Hinduism is often described as polytheistic, but it also contains monistic, pantheistic, and atheistic strands. The Carvaka school, 6th century BCE onward, was a radical materialist philosophy that denied the existence of gods, karma, and afterlife. They advocated direct perception, pratyeka, as the only valid source of knowledge. Orthodox Hindu traditions refuted Carvaka by arguing that moral order and spiritual liberation, moksha, required transcendent grounding. Buddhism generally does not frame itself around a creator deity. Instead, it focuses on the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path as a means of ending suffering, dukkha. The debate here is less about, does God exist, and more about, is transcendence possible? Atheistic Buddhists see enlightenment as a psychological achievement, while some Mahayana traditions invoke cosmic Buddhas or bodhisattvas. Western atheists often find resonance with Buddhism because of its non-theistic metaphysics. Jainism also rejects the idea of a creator god but believes in eternal souls bound by karma. In the Jain worldview, the debate isn't atheism versus theism but rather liberation through self-discipline versus indulgence in worldly life. Confucianism and Taoism. Confucianism emphasizes ethics, family, and social harmony without invoking a personal deity. While rituals honor heaven, Tian, the system is fundamentally moral philosophical rather than theological. Taoism centers on the Tao, way, which is not a personal god but a cosmic principle. Thus, Western categories of atheist/theist don't map neatly here. Comparative religion and varieties of atheism. When comparing religions globally, scholars have noted that atheism is not monolithic. It can take different forms depending on cultural context. Philosophical atheism, the rational rejection of God's existence, common in Western Enlightenment. Practical atheism, living without concern for divine beings, regardless of belief. This is seen in modern secular societies and in Confucian traditions. Political atheism, enforced rejection of religion by states, such as in Maoist China or the Soviet Union. Religious atheism, atheistic strands within religious traditions, like Buddhism without gods, or Carvaka in Hinduism. This diversity shows that the debate is not simply binary but deeply shaped by cultural, historical, and political contexts. Global encounters, colonialism, science, and debate. The colonial period brought Western religious and secular ideas into contact with Eastern traditions. This expanded the debate. Christian missionaries argued that Hinduism, Buddhism, and Taoism lacked the true God, sparking defenses of indigenous traditions. Western atheists encountered non-theistic philosophies in Asia, which provided alternative models of unbelief that did not rely on scientific materialism. Post-colonial thinkers in India, Japan, and China often integrated Western secularism with local philosophies, creating hybrid debates. For example, Indian independence leaders like Jawaharlal Nehru identified as secular humanists while still drawing inspiration from Hindu and Buddhist ethics. In China, Confucian revivalists argued that morality and social harmony could survive without Western religion or Western atheism. Modern global atheisms. In the 21st century, atheism and belief in God are debated worldwide, but with different emphases. Europe. Secularization is strong, with declining church attendance but lingering cultural Christianity. Debates focus on meaning and ethics in post-Christian societies. United States, the debate is sharper, with new atheism clashing against evangelical Christianity and religious conservatism. Middle East, atheism is growing online, especially among youth questioning Islam or Christianity, though often under threat of persecution. Asia. China enforces political atheism, but traditional spirituality and folk religion persist. Japan has widespread practical atheism, yet Shinto rituals remain deeply cultural. India has vibrant debates, with atheists referencing both Western rationalism and Carvaka. Africa, Christianity and Islam dominate, but urban intellectuals increasingly engage in secular humanist thought. This shows that the God debate is not uniform but takes different shapes depending on history and culture. Conclusion: a truly global debate. Part 17 demonstrates that the debate between atheists and believers cannot be understood solely through the Western lens of Christianity versus secularism. In fact, the global history of religion reveals Atheism has ancient roots in Eastern philosophies. Theism itself looks very different across cultures, from personal deities to impersonal cosmic principles. Modern globalization has created new intersections, where Western atheism and Eastern traditions inform one another. In other words, the atheist-theist debate is not one debate but many overlapping debates across cultures and centuries. Part 18, The Digital Age, Internet Atheism, and the Transformation of the Debate Online. Introduction. The 21st century has radically changed how the debate between atheists and theists unfolds. For millennia, this was the domain of books, sermons, academic treatises, and in-person debates. But with the rise of the internet, social media, podcasts, and video platforms, the debate entered a new era of speed, visibility, and accessibility. In this part, we'll explore how the digital age has reshaped both atheism and religious apologetic, the rise of online communities, the impact of social media algorithms, and the ways in which the debate has both expanded globally and, in some ways, become more polarized. The rise of Internet atheism. Early online forums, 1990s, 2000s. The first Internet forums dedicated to atheism and secular humanism emerged in the 1990s. Sites like Internet Infidels and later Reddit's r/atheism gave skeptics a place to share arguments, vent frustrations, and build identity as rational freethinkers. For many, these forums were the first time they encountered a community of unbelievers, especially in regions where atheism was stigmatized. YouTube Atheism Movement, 2006 to 2012. The launch of YouTube democratized debate. Atheist creators like The Amazing Atheist, Thunder00T, and Aaron R.A. gained large followings by critiquing creationism, fundamentalist preaching, and pseudoscience. These channels often positioned atheism as science versus superstition, echoing Enlightenment-era themes. The Four Horsemen of New Atheism, Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, Daniel Dennett, Sam Harris, also went viral through recorded lectures and debates, influencing countless discussions online. Memes and social media. Platforms like Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram allowed atheism to spread in the form of memes, sound bites, and short slogans like, "Religion is a fairy tale for adults." This format often sharpened the tone, making discussions more combative and polarizing. The response: digital apologetic and online faith communities. Religious believers quickly recognized the need to meet atheism online. Christian apologetic channels on YouTube, such as William Lane Craig, Bishop Robert Barron, and Ravi Zacharias International Ministries, began countering atheist claims. Muslim apologists like Zakir Naik and later online debaters argued for the rationality of Islam in the face of rising secular critiques. Jewish and Hindu scholars also entered the digital space, though often with less global reach. Online prayer groups, live-streamed sermons, and TikTok evangelists emerged as digital ministries, aiming to inspire faith in younger generations. In effect, the internet created a new battlefield where apologetic became as much about reach and virality as about arguments. Online polarization, echo chambers and algorithm effects. One defining feature of the internet debate is the rise of echo chambers. Algorithms prioritize engagement, often amplifying the most extreme voices on both sides. Online atheist communities sometimes devolved into mockery of religion rather than nuanced critique. Religious forums often portrayed atheists as immoral or angry, reinforcing stereotypes. This created a feedback loop where debates were less about persuasion and more about tribal identity and culture wars. The democratization of voices. One undeniable benefit of the internet is that it has democratized the debate. Voices that were marginalized in traditional academia, such as ex-Muslims, former evangelical Christians, or youth in conservative societies, could now tell their stories online. Blogs, TikTok videos, and Twitter threads allowed people to share personal deconversion journeys, which often resonated more deeply than philosophical arguments. Believers also used the same platforms to share testimonies of conversion, spiritual experiences, or miraculous claims. This made the debate less abstract and more personal, emotional, and experiential. Globalization of the debate. The internet has also globalized the God debate in unprecedented ways. Atheists in Saudi Arabia or Iran, who risk persecution, can connect with secularists abroad. Evangelical preachers in the United States can live stream sermons to Africa and Asia. Debates once confined to seminar halls in Oxford or Harvard are now live-streamed to millions worldwide. The spread of translated content, subtitled YouTube debates, multilingual podcasts, ensures that the debate is no longer Anglo-European in character. A shift in tone, from philosophy to identity. Historically, the debate centered on metaphysical and epistemological questions. Does God exist? Can morality exist without God? How do we reconcile science and religion? In the digital age, however, the tone often shifts to identity and politics. Atheism is linked to secularism, LGBTQ+ rights, and progressive values. Religion online is tied to cultural heritage, traditional morality, and political movements. The God debate thus becomes entangled with wider culture wars, particularly in the US but increasingly worldwide. Conclusion: a new chapter. The digital age has transformed the debate in at least three key ways. Accessibility: anyone with an internet connection can now participate, not just scholars. Polarization: algorithms amplify conflict, making debates more heated but also less nuanced. Globalization: voices from across cultures and religions now engage with atheism and theism in a shared digital space. The result is a debate that is more visible, personal, and widespread than at any point in history, yet also fragmented and often shallow compared to traditional philosophical discourse. Part 19: The Debate in Contemporary Academia and Science, New Frontiers in Philosophy, Neuroscience, and Cosmology. Introduction. As the 21st century advances, the God debate has entered new intellectual territories. The classical arguments, cosmological, teleological, moral, and ontological, are still discussed, but recent developments in cosmology, neuroscience, and philosophy of mind have reshaped the conversation. Atheists and theists alike now grapple with new data, new scientific theories, and fresh philosophical challenges. In this part, we'll explore how the academic debate has evolved in recent decades, the major schools of thought at play, and how cutting-edge science has become central to the question of belief in God. Cosmology: the universe and its origins. The fine-tuning problem. Modern cosmology has revealed that the physical constants of the universe, gravity, electromagnetism, the cosmological constant, are extraordinarily precise. Theists argue that this fine-tuning suggests intelligent design or a divine creator who calibrated the cosmos for life. Atheists counter with multiverse theories, arguing that our universe is just one of countless universes, and we happen to be in one where life is possible. The Big Bang and its implications. The discovery of the Big Bang reinforced the notion that the universe had a definite beginning. Theists often interpret this as consistent with the idea of creation, ex nihilo, out of nothing, aligning with theological traditions. Atheists point out that quantum cosmology may provide explanations without invoking a deity, such as fluctuations in a quantum vacuum. Neuroscience and the question of consciousness. Religion and the brain. Neuroscience has uncovered brain mechanisms behind religious experiences, such as mystical visions, feelings of transcendence, or moral impulses. Atheists argue these findings show that religion is a product of human cognition, not divine revelation. Theists counter that these mechanisms may be the channels through which God interacts with human beings. The hard problem of consciousness. The nature of consciousness remains one of philosophy's greatest puzzles. Materialists argue that consciousness will eventually be explained by brain processes. Some philosophers, however, suggest consciousness may point beyond materialism, raising questions that resonate with theistic worldviews. The hard problem, why subjective experience exists at all, continues to fuel both sides. Philosophy, analytic theology, and atheistic counterpoints. New theism in academia. Philosophers like Alvin Plantinga and Richard Swinburne revived rigorous theistic philosophy in analytic traditions. Plantinga's modal ontological argument and evolutionary argument against naturalism remain widely discussed. Swinburne defended the probability of God's existence using Bayesian reasoning. Atheistic philosophy. Philosophers like J. L. Mackie, Graham Oppy, and Quinton Smith offered strong atheistic critiques of theism, often focusing on logical coherence and parsimony. The problem of evil continues to be the strongest argument for atheism. If God is all good and all-powerful, why does so much suffering exist? Morality and secular ethics. Theists argue morality is best grounded in a divine source, ensuring objectivity and universality. Atheists respond that evolutionary psychology and social contracts can explain morality without appealing to God. Contemporary debates explore whether concepts like human rights have religious roots, or whether they can stand independently in a secular framework. The ongoing debate in science. Evolution and intelligent design. Evolution remains a central battlefield. While mainstream science accepts evolution by natural selection, intelligent design advocates argue there are irreducible complexities that point to a designer. This debate often plays out not just in academia, but in education and public policy. Artificial intelligence and the future of consciousness. The rise of AI introduces new questions. Can machines ever be conscious? If so, what does that mean for the soul or the uniqueness of human beings? Theists may see human creativity in AI as reflecting divine image, while atheists see it as proof that intelligence can emerge mechanistically. Conclusion. In contemporary academia, the debate between atheists and theists continues to evolve. Cosmology raises questions of origins and fine-tuning. Neuroscience challenges and reframes religious experience. Philosophy refines both theistic and atheistic arguments with analytic precision. Ethics grapples with the foundation of morality. AI and consciousness push the debate into uncharted future territory. Far from being resolved, the debate remains vibrant, demonstrating that the question of God, meaning, and existence is as alive today as ever. Part 20, The Present and Future of the Debate, Where Do We Go From Here? Introduction. The debate between atheism and belief in God has spanned millennia, shifting across cultures, intellectual traditions, and scientific discoveries. Now, in the 21st century, the conversation has entered a new phase. While many of the classic arguments, such as the cosmological, teleological, moral, and problem of evil arguments, still resonate, today's debate is framed in light of modern science, technology, global philosophy, and cultural transformation. In this concluding part, we will explore how the debate stands today, how it might evolve in the future, and why it remains an enduring human question. The present debate. Global perspectives. In the Western world, atheism has become increasingly mainstream, with secularism rising in Europe and parts of North America. In other regions, such as Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East, religion continues to hold significant social, cultural, and political authority. The debate is therefore not uniform, it shifts depending on history, politics, and culture. Public intellectuals. Figures like Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, and Sam Harris gave the New Atheism movement global visibility in the 2000s. Theistic scholars such as William Lane Craig, John Lennox, and Alistair McGrath countered with sophisticated defenses of Christian theism. These debates, often held on university stages or online platforms, brought abstract philosophy into popular discourse. Everyday impact. The God debate is no longer confined to scholars, it is fought in schools, courts, politics, and online communities. Issues such as evolution in education, abortion, AI ethics, and religious freedom laws are deeply tied to whether one sees morality as divinely grounded or humanly constructed. New frontiers of the debate. Science and technology. Artificial intelligence, If machines develop human-like intelligence, will this challenge the uniqueness of human souls, or will it confirm that consciousness can be mechanistic? Cosmology. Questions of fine-tuning and multiverse theories keep the origin of the universe at the forefront of the debate. Neuroscience, mapping the brain's role in religious experience raises the question, does finding a mechanism disprove meaning? Philosophy and ethics. Moral realism without God continues to be hotly debated. Can objective morality exist in a godless universe? Free will versus determinism intersects with both theological doctrines and materialist explanations of human behavior. Interfaith and secular dialogue. The debate is expanding beyond Christianity versus atheism. Scholars now explore Islamic philosophy, Hindu theology, and Buddhist perspectives on existence alongside secular critiques. This globalized conversation reflects the diversity of religious and non-religious thought in the modern world. The future of the debate. Post-secularism. Some argue we are entering a post-secular age where religion and atheism coexist, with mutual influence rather than outright conflict. AI and transhumanism. As humanity pushes into genetic engineering, AI, and space exploration, new questions will emerge. Do these advancements diminish or reinforce the concept of God? Environmental crisis. Climate change and ecological collapse may revive religious perspectives on stewardship while atheists argue for purely secular ethics of survival. Unity or division. The debate could either continue fueling polarization or open pathways to new understandings of meaning that transcend the theism-atheism divide. Why the debate endures. The persistence of the debate suggests it is not merely about intellectual arguments, but about the deepest human needs and questions. Why is there something rather than nothing? What grounds morality and meaning? Is consciousness reducible to matter? What happens after death? These are not simply questions of logic, but of identity, culture, and hope. Conclusion: an unfinished journey. The debate between atheists and theists is far from settled. Each new generation inherits centuries of arguments while facing new data, new cultural realities, and new philosophical puzzles. Whether it ends in resolution, synthesis, or eternal dialogue, the debate continues to shape human civilization. As we stand in the present, looking toward the future, one thing is clear: the question of God, whether answered with belief, doubt, or denial, will remain central to the human story. With that, we've concluded our journey into understanding the debate surrounding the existence of God. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I hope you have a good night's sleep. Background Historian out.